The first thing I felt was the chill, a sudden, sharp cold that swept through me like a gust of wind, except there was no breeze. That's when I realized I had stepped into something far darker than I had anticipated. New Haven, Connecticut, a city that felt like it had more secrets than it cared to reveal. On the surface, it was a picturesque place, nestled between ivy-clad buildings and tree-lined streets. But beneath that calm, there were whispers. Whispers of things that couldn't be explained. Things that went bump in the night. I didn't expect to get involved. As a journalist, I was trained to follow the facts, to report what was visible. But some stories, some mysteries, don't let go once they sink their claws in. That's what happened when I stumbled upon Sarah Benton's case. Sarah Benton had been missing for 6 years. Her disappearance had gone cold. The police had stopped looking for her. But the people of New Haven? They hadn't forgotten. No one had really talked about her in years. But the rumors, the stories, they lingered in the air, heavy and unnerving. I wasn't sure what pulled me in. Maybe it was the gaps in the police report or the strange silence around her name. But something about Sarah's story felt unfinished, like a chapter that hadn't been properly closed. It was a small, almost forgettable case file I found while digging through the archives. But when I opened it, something inside me clicked. I felt it. This wasn't just another missing persons report. There was more to this, more that no one had bothered to uncover. I spent weeks retracing Sarah's steps, talking to anyone who might remember something, anything. People in New Haven were more than willing to share their stories, though most of them seemed almost rehearsed, too convenient, and yet each one contained the same kernel of fear. One night, sitting in a dimly lit coffee shop, I met Frank. Frank had lived in New Haven all his life. He was one of those people who'd seen it all, except he was scared to admit just how much. "People disappear here all the time," he said, stirring his coffee without meeting my eyes. "It's always been like that. You get used to it." He let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "But it's the ones who come back that scare me." His words hung in the air like a bitter taste. I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a long time, then finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't ask about them. People who come back, they're not the same. They carry something. Something you can't see." My skin prickled. It wasn't the kind of response you expected from someone simply talking about missing persons. But Frank wasn't the only one with these eerie stories. Everywhere I went, there was a version of the same tale. And the most disturbing part, it wasn't just the disappearances. It was the ones who returned, changed. I'd spoken to Linda, another local resident, who shared a chilling story. "Sarah wasn't the first," she said, "and she won't be the last. There's something out there, something we don't talk about, something that takes them." I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe a simple explanation, a clear path to a solution. But what I got was a string of dead ends, each one pulling me deeper into something I couldn't explain. As I dug, something became painfully clear. The disappearances weren't random. They followed a pattern, a route. People would vanish in one neighborhood, and weeks later, someone else from a neighboring area would go missing. But the strangest part was the timing. These disappearances, always just before the full moon. It was like something waited for the right moment. Something unseen, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the cycle to repeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was unraveling something far darker than I had imagined. And then there was Dr. Michael Henson. I came across his name over and over again in the old police files. Dr. Henson was a psychiatrist, well respected in the community. He had treated many of the missing people, or at least he had treated them before they disappeared. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was important. So I dug deeper. I tried reaching out to him. His receptionist was polite, almost too polite. Her voice was tight, like she was holding something back. "Doctor, Henson isn't available," she said, every word measured, like a script she had memorized. I pushed for more information, but she cut me off before I could get a word in. "I'm afraid I can't help you. Something didn't sit right." So, I decided to pay Dr. Henson a visit myself. When I arrived at his house late one evening, the quiet that greeted me was unnerving. There was no sign of life, no lights, no movement. I waited in my car for what felt like an eternity. The unease gnawed at me, and I kept telling myself it was nothing, just nerves. But when the lights flickered in his house, I felt a shift, a movement, a shadow. And then came the voice. It wasn't his voice. I knew that for certain. "Leave now." The words were soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear more. But then it came again, louder this time, thick with warning. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." My heart pounded in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in my car and drive away. But something in me, something darker, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to see this through. I approached the door, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. My fingers hovered over the doorbell, but before I could press it, I saw him. Dr. Henson, standing in the window, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was like he had been waiting for me. The next day, he called. His voice was low, almost cautious, like he was testing the waters. "I know what you're looking for," he said. "We need to talk." I agreed to meet him at his clinic, my nerves already on edge. When I arrived, the place was eerily quiet. No patients, no staff, just the sterile smell of antiseptic and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Dr. Henson led me into his office, his movements unnaturally slow, as if he was afraid of making a sound. He locked the door behind us, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're digging in places you shouldn't be," he said, his voice colder now, more measured. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to Sarah Benton and the others." He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "You think this is about missing people?" he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "This is much worse than you think. You're not ready for the truth." He paused, his eyes flickering toward the door, as if he expected someone, or something, to walk in. "It's not the full moon," he said, his voice shaking with fear. "It's the darkness. There's a place, a space between worlds, and it takes them, all of them. The ones who vanish, they don't just disappear. They're lost, trapped, and whatever it is, it doesn't let them go, not until it's too late." I could feel the blood drain from my face as I processed his words. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him it was just paranoia. But something in his eyes, the same terror I had seen in the others, made me believe him. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and the door slammed open with a deafening crash. Dr. Henson's face went white. He stood up, his hands shaking. "We need to leave, now." But it was too late. A shadow filled the room, thick and suffocating. The last thing I remember is the darkness swallowing everything. And then, nothing. I woke up hours later, alone. The clinic was empty. Dr. Henson was gone. His office was a shell of what it had been, quiet and abandoned, like no one had ever been there at all. I've tried to move on. I've tried to forget what happened that night. But every time I close my eyes, I see those eyes, Dr. Henson's eyes. And I know there's something out there, waiting, watching. Maybe it's still watching me. And if you ever find yourself in New Haven, don't let the quiet fool you. You might hear whispers on the wind. You might feel the hairs on your neck stand up for no reason at all. Just remember, not everything that disappears stays gone. And some things never let you go. Not truly.